The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Gasps filled the air. All eyes locked on the uniformed officer, her face frozen in shock, her breath caught in her throat. The tall black man she had just shoved onto the cold, hard floor groaned, rubbing his shoulder. His sharp suit was wrinkled, his dignity momentarily bruised, but his eyes, deep and piercing, never wavered. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Judge Harrison's voice boomed from the bench. The officer, Officer Karen Whitman, stumbled back, her hand still resting on her holster. He was acting suspicious," she stammered, her face turning ashen. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Acting suspicious?" he repeated. "Officer Whitman, do you even know who this man is?" Karen swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. The way the judge was looking at her, the way the entire courtroom was staring, it made her feel small. The man on the floor, now standing, dusted off his sleeve, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let me introduce myself properly," he said, his voice calm but firm. "My name is—" Before he could finish, a loud bang echoed through the room. Everyone turned toward the door, eyes wide with fear. And just like that, chaos erupted. That morning had started like any other for Officer Karen Whitman. She stood in front of her mirror, fixing her uniform, feeling a surge of pride as she clipped on her badge. She had been on the force for nearly 10 years, and in her mind, she was one of the good cops. As she sipped her coffee, the morning news played in the background. Another protest about police brutality. Another debate about justice and race. She rolled her eyes. People just didn't understand what it was like to wear the badge. She had always believed that if people just listened, if they just followed orders, there wouldn't be any problems. That was the problem with them, she thought. They always had something to prove. She grabbed her keys and left her apartment, unaware that today would change her life forever. Inside the courthouse, everything was running smoothly. Karen had been assigned to courtroom security for a high-profile case, though she wasn't paying much attention to the details. Some big-shot lawyer, something about civil rights, some nonsense about corruption, none of it mattered to her. What did matter was keeping order. And to her, order meant making sure people like him didn't cause trouble. She spotted him the moment he walked in. A tall black man in a sleek, expensive suit, his posture straight, his walk confident. Something about him made her uneasy. She had seen men like him before, too sure of themselves, always challenging authority. As he approached the front of the courtroom, Karen's grip tightened on her belt. His kind always thought they were above the rules. She had to remind them otherwise. So when he reached for his phone, she didn't hesitate. "Hey," she snapped. "Hands where I can see them." The man looked at her, confused. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she barked. "Step away from the front." Now, the courtroom had quieted, eyes flickering toward them. The man raised an eyebrow. "Officer, I have every right to be here." Karen clenched her jaw. He was testing her. She wasn't going to let some cocky lawyer walk all over her. "Step back." "I'm not." That was enough for her. Without another thought, she shoved him. Hard. The man stumbled back, tripping over his own feet and hitting the floor with a loud thud. The entire courtroom gasped. Karen's heart pounded in satisfaction until she saw the judge's face, until she heard the whispers, until she noticed the horror in the crowd's eyes, and until she realized who she had just attacked. Then, as if the day couldn't get any worse, the courtroom doors burst open with a deafening bang. The entire room spun toward the entrance. And that's when the real chaos began. Would Karen regret what she did? Would she learn the truth about the man she attacked? And who, or what, had just barged into the courtroom? The answers were coming. But first, the nightmare had only just begun. The sound of the doors slamming open sent a shockwave through the courtroom. People twisted in their seats, eyes darting toward the entrance. Some gasped, others froze in place, their bodies rigid with fear. Karen's pulse pounded as she instinctively reached for her gun. A man stormed into the room, his face red with rage. His heavy boots thudded against the polished courtroom floor as he marched forward. "Everybody stay where you are," his voice boomed. Karen's stomach twisted. She recognized that voice. It was Officer Jake Reynolds, her partner. But something was off. His usual smug confidence had been replaced with frantic energy. His eyes darted around the room, and his hand trembled over his holster. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" Karen demanded. Jake ignored her. His eyes locked onto the man she had shoved just moments ago. "You." Jake spat, his voice dripping with venom. I knew you were up to something. The black man, still standing near the judge's bench, straightened his suit. He was calm, eerily so. Officer Reynolds, he said evenly, you're making a mistake. Jake scoffed. Yeah? So did she. He growled, jerking his chin toward Karen. And I ain't about to let another one slide. The judge pounded his gavel. Enough, his deep voice rang through the room. Officer Reynolds, holster your weapon now. Jake hesitated. He looked between Karen and the man in the suit. His hand twitched, as if unsure whether to obey. The room was suffocating with tension. Karen didn't know what was happening, but for the first time in her career, she felt like she wasn't in control. Then the man spoke again, his voice calm, steady, powerful. My name is. Before he could finish, Jake lunged. Karen barely had time to react before her partner's hands were on the man's collar, shoving him back against the judge's bench. The courtroom erupted in screams. Jake, stop! Karen yelled, but he wasn't listening. The man didn't fight back. He simply looked Jake in the eye and said, You're making the biggest mistake of your life. Karen could see the veins bulging in Jake's neck. His grip tightened. Tell me why you're really here. Jake snarled. Tell me what you're planning. The man held his gaze. I told you, he said. You don't know who I am. And then, a voice rang out from the crowd. Let him go? That's. A deafening crack split the air. The sound of a gunshot. Then chaos. People screamed, ducking behind benches. The judge dove for cover. And Karen? She stood frozen, eyes locked on the horror unfolding before her. The man in the suit staggered, his chest rising and falling rapidly. But it wasn't him who had been shot. It was Jake. His body collapsed to the floor, blood seeping through his uniform. Karen's breath caught in her throat. Her partner, her friend, lying there, struggling to breathe. And standing just a few feet away, gun still smoking, was a hooded figure, a stranger. And suddenly, Karen realized, this was never about the man in the suit. This was something much, much bigger. And she had no idea what she had just stepped into. Earlier that morning, Jake Reynolds had been having a bad day. It started with the phone call. Officer Reynolds, we need you at the courthouse today. Special assignment. Jake frowned, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Why me? There was a pause on the other end. You'll see when you get there, the voice said. Then the line went dead. Jake didn't ask questions. He threw on his uniform, strapped his holster to his belt, and headed out. But something felt off. When he arrived at the courthouse, he noticed Karen immediately. She was doing her usual thing, standing tall, puffing her chest, making sure everyone knew she was in charge. Jake smirked. Typical Karen. Then his eyes landed on him. The man in the suit. Jake's blood ran cold. He recognized him. And he knew exactly why he was here. Jake's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just any courtroom. This wasn't just any case. And that man, he wasn't just some lawyer. No, he was someone far more powerful. Someone who had the ability to change everything. Jake had a choice. He could stay quiet, or he could act before it was too late. Jake made his decision, and that's when he burst through the courtroom doors, gun at the ready. He thought he was stopping a threat, but he was wrong. And now, lying on the floor, bleeding out, he realized it. Too late. The courtroom was in chaos. The hooded figure turned, slipping through the crowd like a shadow. Karen finally snapped out of her trance. Stop them, she shouted, but it was too late. The figure was gone. Jake groaned, his body trembling. Karen dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands against his wound. Stay with me, she whispered. But Jake's eyes weren't on her. He was looking past her, at the man in the suit. You, Jake gasped. You knew this was coming. The man didn't respond. He simply looked down at Jake, his expression unreadable. And then he turned and walked away. Karen's eyes widened. Where do you think you're going? She demanded. The man stopped at the door, his back still turned. Then, finally, he spoke. To finish what was started. And with that, he was gone. Karen clenched her jaw, fury boiling in her veins. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know why he was here. But one thing was clear. She was going to find out. And when she did, she'd make him pay. Even if it was the last thing she ever did. Karen's hands were soaked in blood. Jake's breathing was shallow, his face pale. She pressed down harder on his wound, ignoring the burning ache in her arms. Stay with me, Jake, she said through gritted teeth. His lips moved, but no sound came out. His fingers twitched, grasping at nothing. Someone call an ambulance, a voice screamed from the crowd. The judge was already on his feet, barking orders. People rushed to help, but Karen barely noticed them. All she saw was the empty space where he had been, the man in the suit. He was gone, and so was the hooded figure. A sick feeling settled in her gut. Who was he? Why did Jake think he was dangerous? And most importantly, what was he finishing? Before she could think further, paramedics burst into the courtroom, pushing past the panicked crowd. "Ma'am, let us take over," one of them said. Karen hesitated. Jake's fingers twitched, his eyes rolling toward her. He was trying to say something. "What is it?" she asked, leaning closer. Jake's lips trembled. His voice was barely a whisper. It was never about him. Then his eyes fluttered shut. A machine started beeping wildly. "His pulse is dropping," a paramedic shouted. "We need to move now." Karen staggered back as they lifted Jake onto a stretcher, his body limp. Her heart pounded as they rushed him out of the room. And for the first time in her life, she felt completely lost. 2 hours later, Karen stood outside the hospital, gripping her badge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jake was still in surgery. She had spent the last hour replaying everything in her head, trying to make sense of it all. The man in the suit. The hooded shooter. Jake's last words. It was never about him. Then who was it about? Karen exhaled sharply, forcing herself to focus. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. The courthouse. The room was empty when she returned. The benches were still overturned. Blood still stained the floor. It felt like walking into a crime scene, except she was part of it. She moved toward the judge's bench, her boots echoing in the silence. Something caught her eye. A file. It sat there, slightly open, papers spilling out. Karen frowned. She reached for it, flipping through the pages. Her breath caught in her throat. The man in the suit, his photo was inside. She scanned the documents, her eyes widening with each word. His name, his job, his real identity. And that's when she understood why Jake reacted the way he did, why the judge looked horrified, why the entire courtroom fell into silence when she shoved him. Her hands started to shake, because the man she attacked in court wasn't just anyone. He was one of the most powerful men in the country, and she had just made the worst mistake of her life. The man in the suit walked into a dark room, his expression unreadable. A single light bulb flickered overhead. A man stood waiting in the shadows, his face hidden. "It's done," the man in the suit said. The figure nodded. "Good." There was a pause. "And the cop?" the shadowed man asked. She took the bait. The suited man replied. "Just like we expected." Silence. Then a low chuckle. "Perfect." And just like that, the pieces started to fall into place. The real game had only just begun, and Karen had no idea she was at the center of it. Karen gripped the file tighter, her mind racing. How could I be so stupid? The man she had shoved to the ground wasn't just some lawyer. He wasn't some activist stirring up trouble. He was James Carter, and that name carried weight. James Carter was a former federal prosecutor, one of the most respected legal minds in the country. He had exposed corrupt politicians, taken down entire criminal networks, and was rumored to be working on something even bigger. And she had attacked him. In a courtroom, in front of a judge, witnesses, and cameras. Her stomach churned. Jake had known. That's why he had stormed in like a madman. That's why he had grabbed Carter, demanding answers. But then, the hooded shooter. The gunshot. Jake was fighting for his life, and Carter had disappeared. Karen forced herself to focus. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the words. Then she saw it. A name. The Whitmore case. Karen had never heard of it before, but something about it made her uneasy. She kept reading. It was an investigation into high-ranking law enforcement officials, judges, chiefs of police, detectives. And suddenly, Karen felt sick. There was a list of names. And at the bottom of that list, Jake Reynolds, her partner's name, her best friend's name, was inside this file. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. What the hell had Jake gotten himself into? And why was James Carter investigating him? A sharp knock on the courtroom door made Karen jump. She turned quickly, stuffing the file into her jacket. A security guard peered in. "You still in here, Officer Whitman?" Karen swallowed hard, nodding. "Yeah, just making sure everything's secure." The guard eyed her for a second, then nodded. "They're reviewing the courtroom footage. Judge Harrison wants to speak with you." Karen forced a tight smile. "I'll be right there." The guard left. Karen's heart pounded. They were reviewing the footage. Meaning, any second now, they'd see exactly what she had done. And the second they did, her career would be over. Karen had never been scared to face a judge before, but when she walked into Judge Harrison's chambers, she felt like a death row inmate waiting for a verdict. The judge sat behind his massive oak desk, his piercing blue eyes locked onto her the moment she entered. Behind him, a TV screen replayed the courtroom footage. Karen flinched as she watched herself shove James Carter onto the floor. The video paused. Judge Harrison exhaled slowly. Officer Whitman. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Karen stiffened. Yes, Your Honor. He leaned forward, folding his hands. Would you like to explain what in God's name you were thinking? Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in her career, she had no excuse. No justification. She had acted on instinct. And now, she was paying for it. The judge shook his head. Do you realize what you've done? Karen forced herself to hold his gaze. Yes, she said quietly. You assaulted a federal prosecutor. In a courtroom. In front of a judge. And then, he gestured to the screen. Chaos erupted. A shooting. A nearly fatal injury to an officer. And now, James Carter is missing. Karen felt her stomach drop. Missing? Carter had walked out of the courtroom. She had seen him leave. Hadn't she? Judge Harrison continued. The press is already swarming the building. They're asking why an officer, a white officer, physically attacked an unarmed black man in the middle of a trial. Karen's jaw clenched. He was making it about race. She had always hated that. But deep down, she knew why he was saying it. Because to everyone watching, that's exactly what it looked like. A white cop attacking a black man for no reason. Karen swallowed hard. Your Honor, Save it. The judge's voice was sharp. Your badge is already under review. Internal Affairs will be investigating. Karen's fists tightened. What about the shooter? The hooded figure? Shouldn't we be focusing on? We are, the judge interrupted. But don't think for a second that your actions are being ignored. Karen wanted to argue, to scream, but she didn't, because she knew she had no one on her side. Except maybe Jake, if he survived. And suddenly, Karen realized something. If James Carter was investigating Jake, then Jake might have answers. Answers that she desperately needed. Karen left the judge's chambers in a daze. She needed to get to the hospital. She needed to talk to Jake before it was too late. But as she stepped outside the courthouse, she froze. Reporters, dozens of them. Microphones, cameras, flashing lights. And then, she saw the headline on one of the TV trucks. Her stomach dropped. Racist cop attacks black attorney in court. FBI now involved. Karen's heart slammed against her ribs. FBI? She turned quickly, gripping her belt. And that's when she saw them. Two men in suits, walking straight toward her. And she knew. She was about to be arrested. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The two men in dark suits moved toward her with purpose, their faces unreadable. The FBI. She wasn't stupid. She had seen how this played out before. A cop screws up, especially a white cop in a case involving race, and the entire country turns against them. Her hands twitched toward her badge. Could she explain? Would they listen? No time to think. The taller agent, a black man in his mid-40s with a sharp jawline, held up a badge. Officer Karen Whitman. Karen nodded slowly. I'm Special Agent Daniel Hayes. This is Agent Miller. We need you to come with us. Karen forced herself to stay calm. Am I under arrest? Agent Hayes hesitated. Not yet. Not yet. Karen's stomach twisted. The cameras were rolling. Reporters had caught sight of the confrontation, and she could already hear them shouting. Officer Whitman, did you target James Carter because he's black? Are you being fired from the force? Is it true that Carter is missing? Karen clenched her jaw. The world was already against her. Agent Miller, a shorter, stockier man with gray at his temples, stepped forward. We need to talk somewhere private. This isn't just about your incident. Karen's eyes narrowed. Then what is it about? Hayes exhaled. James Carter. We think he's in danger. Karen stiffened. Something inside her told her to run. To get to the hospital and talk to Jake before these guys pulled her into a mess she couldn't escape. But before she could react, Hayes leaned in and whispered, and we think your partner was working against him. Karen's breath hitched. Jake? No, that couldn't be right. Jake was a lot of things, reckless, arrogant, hot-headed, but he wasn't corrupt. Was he? Karen looked between the two agents. She had a choice. If she went with them, she might find out the truth about James Carter. About Jake. If she ran to the hospital, she might still get answers, but she'd look guilty as hell. She inhaled sharply. Fine, she said. I'll come with you. The FBI's office was cold. Too clean. Too quiet. Karen sat across from Agent Hayes in a dimly lit room, her nerves on edge. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. Hayes folded his hands. Tell me what you know about James Carter. Karen scoffed. You mean besides the fact that I accidentally made him the most famous man in America? Hayes didn't smile. Karen sighed. I don't know him. Never met him before today. I thought he was just some lawyer. She hesitated. She had nearly said, I thought he was up to something. But she knew how that sounded. Racist. She cleared her throat. I didn't realize who he was until after the fact. Hayes studied her. So you shoved him for no reason? Karen gritted her teeth. He was acting suspicious. Suspicious how? He reached into his pocket. I thought he was pulling a weapon. Was he? Karen clenched her jaw. No. A long silence. Hayes leaned forward. What do you know about the Whitmore case? Karen's pulse quickened. Don't show weakness. She shrugged. Never heard of it. Hayes slid a folder across the table. Inside was a picture of James Carter standing outside a courthouse, shaking hands with a woman. Karen frowned. Who's that? Angela Whitmore, Hayes said. She was a whistleblower. Exposed corruption inside law enforcement. Carter was helping her. Karen sat up straighter. Hayes exhaled. She's dead. Car accident last month. But Carter doesn't think it was an accident. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. She looked back at the photo. Angela Whitmore. A whistleblower. Exposing corruption. And Jake's name was in the file. You think Jake had something to do with this? Karen said quietly. Hayes didn't answer right away. We don't know yet. Karen shook her head. No way. Jake's reckless, but he's not a murderer. Hayes didn't respond. Karen felt her frustration boiling. Look, what do you need from me? Hayes leaned back. We need to find James Carter. Before whoever shot your partner finds him first. Karen hesitated. And what if I say no? Hayes gave her a knowing look. Then internal affairs buries you. Your badge is gone. Your career is over. And the media? He gestured toward the TV screen in the corner of the room, where her face was plastered all over the news. They'll make sure the whole country hates you. Karen exhaled sharply. She had no choice. Fine, she muttered. Where do we start? Hayes slid a phone toward her. James Carter called 911 after leaving the courthouse. Said he was being followed. Karen's heart pounded. The last known location pinged on the map. An abandoned warehouse. On the other side of town. Karen's gut twisted. She knew that area. It was gang territory. And if Carter was there, he was already running out of time. 30 minutes later, Karen and the FBI agents arrived at the warehouse. The building was massive, dark, and silent. Too silent. Karen unholstered her gun. Stay close, Hayes whispered. The team moved in, their footsteps echoing. Dust floated in the air, and the smell of rust filled Karen's nose. Then, a noise. A low groan. Karen's heart slammed in her chest. She moved toward the sound, gun raised. Her flashlight cut through the darkness. And then she saw him. James Carter, slumped against a metal crate. Blood dripping from his temple. Barely conscious. Jesus, Karen muttered, rushing forward. His eyes fluttered open. He saw her, and flinched. Stay back, he croaked. Karen froze. Carter, we're here to help. He coughed, shaking his head. You don't understand. Karen frowned. Understand what? Carter struggled to speak, his breathing ragged. Then he forced out 3 words that sent a chill through her spine. It's a setup. Karen barely had time to react before. Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. Get down, Hayes shouted. Karen grabbed Carter, dragging him behind cover. Her heart pounded. Who the hell was shooting at them? Then, a voice rang out. Deep. Cold. Familiar. You should have stayed out of this, Whitman. Karen's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. And when she turned, her stomach dropped. The man standing there, gun in hand, aiming straight at her, was Jake. Karen's heart stopped. She stared at Jake, her partner, her friend, but the man standing in front of her wasn't the Jake she knew. His uniform was gone. He wore dark civilian clothes, his badge nowhere in sight. His eyes, once filled with cocky arrogance, were now cold, calculating. And in his hand, steady as a rock, was a gun, pointed right at her. Jake, she whispered. James Carter groaned beside her, barely conscious. Karen tightened her grip on him, her mind racing. Jake tilted his head, his face unreadable. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? Karen swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about. Jake let out a low, humorless chuckle. Come on, Karen. Don't insult me. The gun in his hand didn't waver. Step away from Carter, Jake ordered. Now. Karen's blood ran cold. Why? She asked carefully. Because he's a dead man, Jake said simply. Karen's grip on her gun tightened. What the hell is going on, Jake? Jake's jaw clenched. It's not what you think. Karen glanced at Hayes and Miller. The FBI agents were frozen, their hands hovering near their weapons. They didn't know whether to shoot or stand down. One wrong move, and this whole thing could turn into a bloodbath. Karen took a slow breath. She had to keep Jake talking. Tell me, then, she said, her voice steady. What am I missing? Jake's eyes flickered to the shadows behind her, as if checking for something, or someone. Karen felt a prickle of unease. She wasn't just dealing with Jake. She was dealing with whoever he was working for. And judging by the way he held himself, they had full control over him. Carter has to die, Jake said flatly. It's bigger than you, Karen. Bigger than me. You don't understand the things he's been digging into. Karen's mind flashed back to the file. The Whitmore case. The corruption. The names. Jake was on that list. And now she knew why. Karen's stomach twisted. You killed Angela Whitmore, didn't you? Jake's face hardened. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Then, I didn't have a choice. Karen felt like she'd been punched. Her partner. Her best friend. A murderer. Jake sighed. Rubbing his temple like this was all some minor inconvenience. Look, Karen, I liked you. You were a good cop. But you need to walk away. This is out of your league. Karen didn't move. Who are you working for? She demanded. Jake smirked. You don't want to know. A shadow moved behind him. Karen barely had time to register it before. A second gunshot rang out. Jake jerked forward, his body twisting, then collapsed onto the floor. Karen's brain barely caught up. Someone had shot him. But not her. Not the FBI. She turned sharply and saw the hooded figure from the courtroom. Karen's breath hitched. The shooter who had nearly killed Jake before had just saved her. The hooded figure lowered their gun. And then, they pulled back their hood. Karen's world tilted. It was Angela Whitmore. But that was impossible. Angela Whitmore was dead. Wasn't she? Karen's mind spun, trying to process the impossible. Jake groaned on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder, still alive but barely conscious. Angela, if that was really her, stared down at him, her face emotionless. You were always weak, she said coldly. Karen couldn't breathe. I don't understand. You're dead. Angela finally looked at her. They tried, she said. But they failed. Karen felt like she was standing in the middle of a nightmare. James Carter coughed beside her, still struggling to stay awake. Angela turned to him. We need to get him out of here. Hayes finally found his voice. What the hell is going on? Angela ignored him. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a burner phone. We don't have time, she said. They're coming. Karen's head was spinning. Angela Whitmore was alive. Jake was a traitor. James Carter was still in danger. And whoever they were coming. Karen had one chance to decide. Trust Angela Whitmore, a woman who was supposed to be dead, or walk away. Karen looked at Jake, groaning on the floor, and knew she couldn't turn back now. Whatever the truth was, she had to find it. She turned to Angela. Tell me what's going on. Angela's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. And then, the warehouse exploded. A massive fireball ripped through the side of the building, sending metal and debris flying. Karen was thrown backward, her ears ringing. The world spun. Smoke choked the air. And as she fought to stay conscious, she saw dark figures moving through the haze. Armed men. They were here. And they weren't leaving without a body count. Karen struggled to move, to grab her gun. But before she could, everything went black. A high-pitched ringing filled Karen's ears. Her body ached. Her skin was covered in dust and soot. The world around her felt distant, like she was underwater. She opened her eyes to flickering light and chaos. The warehouse was on fire, flames licking the walls, smoke curling toward the night sky. Gunshots rang out. Karen's pulse spiked. She forced herself onto her elbows, blinking through the haze. Dark figures moved in the smoke, their weapons flashing with every shot fired. They're here. Angela Whitmore crouched a few feet away, gripping a pistol, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. James Carter was slumped against a pile of debris, barely conscious. Jake was gone. Karen's heart pounded. Was he dead? Had he escaped? No time to think. Angela locked eyes with her. We need to move. Now. Karen's muscles screamed as she pushed herself up. "What the hell is happening?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. Angela fired a shot over her shoulder, ducking behind a metal crate. "They're tying up loose ends." Karen didn't need to ask who they were. Whoever Jake had been working for, whoever had sent that shooter into the courtroom, had just leveled an entire building to make sure their secrets stayed buried. Karen turned, scanning the chaos. Hayes and Miller were pinned down, trapped behind a collapsed steel beam. One of the agents was injured, gripping his leg. Karen's stomach twisted. If they didn't get out now, none of them were making it out alive. Angela reached into her jacket and tossed Karen a fresh clip. "You still want to be a cop?" she asked. Karen caught the ammo, shoved it into her gun, and took a deep breath. "Let's do this." The first man Karen saw was moving through the smoke, his rifle raised. She didn't hesitate. A single crack rang out as she fired. The man crumpled. Karen's breath came fast, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She wasn't just defending herself, she was fighting back. Angela moved like a ghost, weaving through the shadows, her shots clean and precise. But there were too many of them. For every one they took down, two more appeared. And then, a bullet whizzed past Karen's ear. She turned just in time to see a masked man charging straight at her. He tackled her, slamming her into the ground. Her gun skidded across the floor. Karen gasped, struggling beneath his weight. He pinned her down, his knee pressing into her chest. She clawed at him, reaching for anything. Her hand found a broken metal pipe. She swung it hard. It connected with his head. The man grunted, stumbling back. Karen kicked him off, scrambling for her gun. She barely had time to aim before. Bang! The man collapsed. Karen turned, breathing hard. Angela stood a few feet away, her gun smoking. "Nice work," she said, eyes scanning the chaos. "But we're outnumbered. We need to go." Karen's pulse pounded. "And leave the others?" Angela hesitated. Then, to Karen's shock, she tossed her gun aside. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen hissed. Angela reached into her jacket and pulled out a small detonator. Karen's stomach dropped. "No," she said. "No, no, no." Angela didn't answer. She pressed the button. A second explosion ripped through the warehouse. Karen was thrown back again, the shockwave rattling her skull. Flames erupted from the far end of the building. Angela grabbed Carter and ran. Karen coughed, struggling to her feet. Smoke filled her lungs. She turned toward where Hayes and Miller had been. The entire area was in flames. They were gone. Karen staggered forward, her mind spinning. Had Angela just killed them? She turned, fury boiling inside her. Angela was dragging Carter toward a black SUV parked outside. Karen sprinted after them. She grabbed Angela's arm, yanking her back. "What did you do?" Karen shouted. Angela's eyes were cold. "I did what had to be done." Karen's chest heaved. "You blew up a federal agent. You just—" "I saved your life," Angela snapped. Karen felt like she was going to be sick. She turned toward the burning warehouse, flames licking the sky. Somewhere inside that fire, Jake was still alive. Karen knew it. And if Jake survived, then this wasn't over. Not even close. Angela grabbed Karen's wrist, forcing her to look at her. "Do you want answers?" Angela demanded. Karen's breathing was ragged. "Yes." "Then get in the car." Karen hesitated. She could stay, wait for backup, tell the truth. Or she could go with Angela, go down the rabbit hole, find out what was really going on. Karen clenched her fists. Then she got in the car. Angela slammed the door shut. The SUV peeled away from the burning warehouse, disappearing into the night. Karen stared out the window, her mind racing. Somewhere in that fire, the truth was still buried. But Karen was done being in the dark. It was time to burn it all down. The SUV tore through the city streets, the headlights slicing through the darkness. Karen sat in the back seat, her hands clenched into fists. James Carter lay next to her, groaning, blood still dripping from his temple. Angela Whitmore gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, her gaze locked straight ahead. Karen's mind raced. The warehouse was gone. FBI agents Hayes and Miller gone. Jake alive. Somewhere. And now, Karen was sitting in a car with a dead woman. Angela was supposed to be buried in the ground. Instead, she had just blown up a building and dragged Karen along for the ride. Karen exhaled sharply, forcing her voice steady. "Start talking." Angela didn't blink. "Not yet." Karen's patience snapped. "Not yet? I just watched you." "Shut up." Angela's voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Karen tensed. Angela wasn't like the criminals she had chased before. She wasn't some thug in the streets or a desperate lowlife. Angela knew things. She wasn't hiding. She was playing a game. Karen just didn't know the rules yet. James Carter groaned, shifting beside her. His voice was weak. Where are we going? Angela glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Somewhere safe. Karen's stomach twisted. She didn't believe that for a second. 20 minutes later, the SUV pulled into a secluded underground parking garage beneath an abandoned office building. Angela parked and killed the engine. Silence filled the space, except for the distant hum of the city above. Karen stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. No movement. No cameras. Angela had planned this. James Carter struggled to his feet, wobbling slightly. Karen instinctively reached to steady him, but he waved her off. I'm fine, he muttered. Angela walked to a rusted metal door and punched in a code. The lock clicked. She looked over her shoulder. Inside, Karen's gut screamed at her to turn back. But she didn't. She followed Angela inside. The room was small, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb. A map covered one of the walls, covered in red strings connecting locations across the city. Stacks of files cluttered a wooden desk. Karen's eyes narrowed. This wasn't a hideout. This was a war room. Angela shut the door behind them. She tossed her gun onto the desk and turned to face them. It's time you knew the truth. Karen crossed her arms. Start with how you're alive. Angela smirked. They never buried me. That's not an answer. Angela leaned against the desk. I faked my death. I had to. Karen's pulse quickened. Why? Angela exhaled. Because I was about to expose something big. Bigger than I ever imagined. She turned and grabbed a file. Karen's breath caught. The Whitmore case. Angela tossed it onto the desk. This isn't just about corruption. It's about control. Karen hesitated. What do you mean? Angela's gaze darkened. There's a group operating in the shadows. They're embedded in law enforcement, politics, everywhere. They don't just protect dirty cops. They own them. Karen's throat went dry. Angela continued. When I started digging, I realized the corruption didn't stop at low-level officers. It went higher, much higher. Karen's fingers curled into fists. How high? Angela met her eyes. The chief of police. Karen froze. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. No, she whispered. That's impossible. Angela didn't blink. Your department is compromised. The people you trust? They're part of it. Karen's mind reeled. The chief? The man who had given her her badge? Angela continued. When I uncovered the truth, I became a liability. So they tried to erase me. Karen swallowed hard. And Jake? Angela's jaw tightened. He was working for them. Karen shook her head. No. He was reckless, sure. But he wasn't dirty. Angela's expression didn't change. He was more than dirty. He was the enforcer. Karen's stomach twisted. Jake wasn't just involved. He was one of them. Angela's voice turned cold. He tried to kill me. I barely escaped. Karen felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. She had spent years trusting Jake, watching his back, drinking beers after long shifts. And all that time, he had been playing her. James Carter finally spoke, his voice raspy. They're cleaning house. Karen looked at him. What do you mean? Carter exhaled. They tried to kill Angela. They nearly killed me. And now, they're coming for you. Karen stiffened. She knew too much now. And if this group was as powerful as Angela said, they weren't going to let her walk away. Angela grabbed another file and flipped it open. Inside was a list of names. Karen's eyes scanned them, her heart pounding. Jake Reynolds. Chief Douglas Monroe. Judge Harrison. And then, at the very bottom, Karen Whitman. Her breath caught. Angela's voice was low. They've already marked you. Karen's hands trembled. This wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about surviving it. Angela turned to her, eyes sharp. So tell me, Officer Whitman, are you ready to burn it all down? Karen inhaled sharply. For years, she had believed in the badge. In justice. In order. Now she was ready for war. Karen stared at the list, her name etched in ink like a death sentence. She felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating her with the weight of betrayal. Her partner had been dirty. Her chief was part of a secret network. The judge, the very man who had lectured her, was compromised. And now, they wanted her dead. Angela watched her carefully. You understand what this means, don't you? Karen exhaled, her fists tightening. Yeah. It's only a matter of time before they come after you. James Carter muttered, rubbing his bruised forehead. They don't leave loose ends. Karen's mind spun. Her entire career had been built on believing in the system. That bad cops were the minority. That justice was real. Now she realized. She had been a fool. Angela flipped another page in the file. I've spent years tracking them, but they're careful. They don't just bribe people. They own them. They dig into your past, your weaknesses. They make sure you're either with them or you disappear, Carter finished grimly. Karen took a shaky breath. How many people are involved? Angela gave a humorless smile. More than you want to know. Carter leaned forward. But here's the good news. Karen scoffed. There's good news? He nodded. We have a way in. Karen's pulse quickened. How? Angela tapped a page. Jake. Karen's breath caught. Carter smirked. Your buddy isn't dead, Whitman. And trust me, he's going to lead us right to them. Karen clenched her jaw. And when he does? Angela's voice was ice. We cut the head off the snake. The plan was insane. Karen, Angela, and Carter sat in the dimly lit hideout, going over every detail. The organization operated in cells. Low-level officers never met the higher-ups. Orders were passed down in whispers. Money moved through shell corporations and offshore accounts. They had one weakness. Jake. Angela had planted a tracker on him before the explosion. If he was still alive, and Karen was sure he was, he'd go running to his handlers. And when he did, Karen would be waiting. You think he'll talk? Karen asked. Angela shook her head. No, but we don't need him to. She turned the laptop around. A blinking red dot appeared on the map. Jake's location. Karen swallowed hard. He was moving, heading toward a secluded mansion outside the city. Karen's stomach twisted. That's not just a safe house, is it? Carter shook his head. No, that's where the real players meet. Karen inhaled sharply. This was it. A chance to expose them. To end this. Angela locked eyes with her. If we do this, there's no turning back. Karen's pulse thundered. Good, she said. I don't want to turn back. Angela smirked. Then she pulled 3 black masks from her bag. Then let's crash the party. The mansion was heavily guarded. Karen crouched in the shadows with Angela and Carter, watching from a distance. Armed men patrolled the perimeter. Security cameras scanned the entrance. No way in without a fight. Angela whispered, we move fast. Get inside before they know what hit them. Karen's fingers twitched over her gun. And then, Carter's voice was calm. Then we take down the people who think they own this city. Karen took a deep breath. She had spent her whole life following rules. Now, she was about to break them all. Angela glanced at her. You ready? Karen's lips curled into a smirk. Let's burn it all down. Then, they moved. The night air was thick with tension. Karen's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she, Angela, and Carter crept toward the mansion's perimeter. Armed guards patrolled the grounds, their movements precise and disciplined. These weren't just bodyguards, they were professionals. Angela motioned for them to stop, pressing her back against a tree. She pulled out a small tablet and tapped the screen. Karen watched as the security cameras glitched. A small smirk played on Angela's lips. That'll give us about 5 minutes before they reboot. Carter checked his pistol. 5 minutes to get in, grab Jake, and get out? Karen exhaled sharply. Not enough time. Angela shot her a look. Then we better move fast. They slipped past the first guard, keeping to the shadows. Karen's pulse quickened as they neared the side entrance. A keypad blinked red by the door. Angela pulled out a device, attached it to the panel, and within seconds, click, the door unlocked. They slipped inside. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with expensive paintings and marble floors. Karen's grip on her gun tightened as they moved swiftly through the corridors. A voice echoed from deeper inside the mansion. Karen froze. She knew that voice. Jake. She exchanged a glance with Angela. They followed the sound, pressing against the wall as they approached a large double door. Angela reached for the handle, then stopped. Her eyes darted to Karen, her voice a whisper. Listen. Karen strained her ears. Jake was talking to someone, but not just anyone. The chief. Karen's breath hitched. Chief Douglas Monroe, the man who had given her her badge, the man who had shaped her entire career, was in that room. And from the way they were talking, he wasn't just involved. He was in charge. Inside the room, Jake's voice was tense. They're still alive. The chief's tone was ice. That's unacceptable. Jake exhaled sharply. I had Carter. Whitmore should be dead. But the chief cut him off. But they're not. Silence. Then, the chief sighed. Jake, you've been a valuable asset. But we don't tolerate failure. Karen felt her stomach drop. This wasn't a debriefing. This was an execution. Jake must have realized it too, because his voice shook. I can fix this. The chief chuckled. No, Jake. You can't. Karen's mind raced. She should let him die. Jake had betrayed her, betrayed everything. But if they let this happen, they'd lose their only way to expose the network. Karen gritted her teeth. Damn it. She moved before she could think, kicking the door open. Gun raised. Jake's eyes widened. The chief's expression barely flickered. Well, he mused. This is unexpected. Angela and Carter moved in behind Karen, weapons trained on the room. The chief sighed, shaking his head. Karen, I expected better from you. Karen's hands shook. The man who had mentored her, who had shaped her entire career, was looking at her like she was nothing. I trusted you, Karen whispered. The chief's gaze hardened. That was your first mistake. Then, he moved. Karen barely had time to react as he flipped the desk over, drawing a weapon. Gunfire erupted. Karen dove for cover. Jake hit the ground, crawling for his gun. Angela fired, clipping one of the chief's guards in the leg. Karen whirled around, aiming for the chief. But he was already running. Damn it, Angela hissed. Carter grabbed Jake by the collar, yanking him up. We're not leaving empty-handed. Jake struggled. Get off me. Karen grabbed his gun, pressing it under his chin. Jake froze. You're coming with us, Karen growled. Jake's jaw clenched, but he didn't fight. Angela was already moving. We need to go now. They bolted for the exit. Behind them, alarms blared. Guards swarmed the hallway. Karen grabbed Jake, dragging him forward as bullets whizzed past. Angela fired over her shoulder. Keep moving. They burst through the front door, straight into chaos. Black SUVs were pulling up, more armed men spilling out. Karen's stomach dropped. They were surrounded. A voice rang out from the darkness. Deep. Commanding. Familiar. You're not going anywhere. Karen turned and saw the chief, standing by one of the SUVs, completely unharmed. Karen's blood ran cold. How the hell had he gotten out so fast? The chief smiled, as if reading her thoughts. You still don't get it, do you? He mused. You were never going to win. Karen's grip on her gun tightened. Angela tensed beside her. Karen, she warned. The chief sighed, shaking his head. You had so much potential. Such a waste. Karen raised her weapon. And that's when everything went black. A sharp crack of a rifle. A piercing pain exploded in Karen's side. She hit the ground, hard. Angela screamed her name. Carter fired wildly into the crowd. Jake lunged forward, shouting something. But Karen couldn't hear. Her vision blurred. The chief's boots stepped toward her. He crouched beside her, his face calm. I told you, he murmured. Then, darkness. Karen drifted in and out of consciousness. Pain burned in her side, hot and relentless. Her body felt heavy, her limbs refusing to move. Voices swirled around her, distant and muffled, like she was underwater. Where am I? She tried to open her eyes, but darkness pulled her under again. Then, a voice. Close. Familiar. Cold. Don't bother struggling. Karen's mind snapped awake. Her body screamed in protest, but she forced her eyes open. The world blurred at first, shapes twisting and shifting, before coming into focus. A warehouse. Dim lights. Concrete floors. She was tied to a chair, her wrists bound. Tight. And standing in front of her. The chief. Karen's breath hitched. He was calm. Too calm. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive suit, then tucked his hands into his pockets. You always were stubborn, he mused. That's what I liked about you. Karen's jaw clenched. Rage burned through her veins. He had betrayed everything. Her. The force. The badge. The chief sighed. I tried to give you a way out. You should have taken it. Karen's voice was raw. Go to hell. The chief chuckled, shaking his head. You still think you're on the right side of this, don't you? Karen's fingers curled into fists. The chief leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Tell me, Karen, after everything you've seen, do you really believe in justice? Karen didn't answer, because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure. The system she had spent her entire life protecting was rotten to the core. Angela had been right. Carter had been right. Jake had been right. Karen's stomach twisted at the thought of him. Jake, where was he? Was he still alive? The chief studied her face. You're thinking about him, aren't you? Karen's eyes snapped up. The chief smirked. Jake always was useful. Until he wasn't. Karen's chest tightened. What did you do to him? She whispered. The chief straightened, adjusting his tie. Nothing. Then he turned his head slightly, and Karen heard it. A weak, ragged groan. Her pulse spiked. She turned sharply, her breath catching. Jake. He was slumped against a wall, handcuffed, his face bruised and bloodied. But he was alive. Relief flooded through Karen's body before the anger set in. Jake had betrayed her. He had worked for these people. But now, he was in the same hell she was. And that meant something. Karen looked back at the chief. Let him go. The chief laughed. You're not in a position to make demands. Karen's nails dug into her palms. You need him alive, don't you? The chief's eyes darkened. Bingo. Karen forced herself to sit up, despite the searing pain in her side. He knows things. Things you can't afford getting out. The chief's jaw twitched. Karen smirked despite herself. For the first time, she had leverage. But the chief recovered quickly. He clapped his hands together once, the sound sharp in the empty warehouse. You're not as smart as you think you are, Whitman. Karen braced herself. Enlighten me. The chief pulled out a folder. Her blood ran cold. Inside were photos. Of her family, her father's house, her mother's nursing home. Karen's throat closed. The chief flipped through the pages lazily. You see, Karen, this was never just about you. He tapped a photo of her younger brother. Karen's entire body went still. Did you know your brother just bought a new apartment? The chief asked, his tone casual. I hear it's a beautiful place. Karen's heart pounded. Her baby brother. The only family she had left. The chief smiled. It'd be a shame if something happened to him. Karen saw red. She lunged forward. The ropes dug into her wrists, burning her skin. The chief didn't even flinch. He just watched her struggle, his expression bored. Then he sighed. This is how it's going to go, Officer Whitman, he said, his voice eerily calm. You're going to take the fall for all of this. Karen froze. You attacked Carter. You tried to cover it up. You went rogue. He tilted his head. And Jake? Well, let's just say he was trying to bring you in. Karen's blood boiled. They were setting her up, framing her. She would be the villain. Everything, the corruption, the murders, all of it, would be swept under the rug. And she would rot in prison for crimes she didn't commit. The chief crouched in front of her. Or, Karen's breath shook. There's another option, the chief murmured. Karen didn't speak. The chief leaned in. Join us. Karen's stomach turned. The chief smirked. You're smart. Ruthless. The kind of officer we need. You think this country runs on justice? It doesn't. It runs on control. And control, he tapped her forehead lightly, comes from people like us. Karen felt sick. Join them? Be part of the very system she had spent her entire life believing in? The chief's smile widened. Think about it, Whitman. Because if you say no, his voice dropped to a whisper. Your brother dies. Karen's heart stopped. The chief stood up, brushing off his suit. I'll give you until morning. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The warehouse door slammed shut, leaving Karen alone, with Jake, and a choice. Karen sat in the silence, her body shaking. Across from her, Jake groaned, shifting slightly. Karen's voice was hoarse. Are you awake? Jake coughed, his head rolling toward her. Barely, he rasped. Karen exhaled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Jake's voice was barely a whisper. I'm sorry. Karen's throat tightened. She could hate him later. Right now, she had one focus. Getting out of here. And when she did, she would end this. All of it. Even if it was the last thing she ever did. Karen sat in the dimly lit warehouse, her wrists raw from the ropes, her side throbbing from the gunshot wound. The chief's words echoed in her skull. Join us, or your brother dies. The room smelled of oil and blood. The silence between her and Jake was thick, heavy with unfinished war. She should have hated him. He had betrayed her. But right now, he was the only person who might help her make it out of this alive. Jake groaned, shifting against his restraints. His face was battered, but his voice was steady. You can't take the deal. Karen shot him a glare. You think I would? Jake exhaled, closing his eyes for a second. I know what they do to people who say no. Karen knew too. They disappear. She clenched her jaw. Then we make sure they don't get the chance. Jake let out a dry chuckle. You got a plan, Whitman? Karen did. And it was insane. The first step was getting free. Karen focused, flexing her wrists against the ropes, loosening them inch by inch. Her skin burned as the fibers cut into her, But she didn't stop. Jake watched her, his expression unreadable. They're gonna kill me either way, aren't they? Karen didn't answer. She had seen it before, when a corrupt system decided someone was expendable. Jake knew too much. If she left him behind, he was dead. Karen gritted her teeth. Damn it, Jake. After everything, I should leave you here. But she couldn't. Because despite his betrayal, they were on the same side now. And she wasn't going to let the chief win. With one final pull, the ropes around her wrists snapped. Jake's eyes widened. Well, I'll be damned. Karen quickly moved to untie his restraints. Move fast, she whispered. We don't have much time. Jake gave a weak smirk. Now you're starting to sound like me. Karen glared. Shut up and get ready to run. They burst out of the room like a wildfire. Karen grabbed the first guard by the throat, slamming him into the wall. His gun clattered to the floor, and she snatched it up. Jake moved beside her, swinging a stolen knife into another guard's leg. Alarms blared. Voices shouted. They tore through the warehouse, taking out anyone in their way. Karen's mind was clear. She had one goal. Get out. Get to her brother. Then burn everything down. They crashed through the side exit and into the night. A black SUV was parked outside. Jake didn't hesitate. He hotwired it in seconds. Karen jumped in beside him, blood drying against her uniform. The tires screeched as they tore out of the warehouse district. Behind them, the chief's men spilled out of the building, guns raised. But they were too late. Karen turned to Jake. Do you know where my brother is? Jake's knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. Yeah, he muttered. And if we don't get there first, they'll kill him. Karen's heart pounded. The chief had been one step ahead of them this whole time. But not anymore. The drive was a blur. Karen could barely breathe as they sped toward her brother's apartment, sirens wailing in the distance. They arrived in minutes, pulling into the alley beside the building. Karen jumped out before the car even fully stopped. She ran up the stairs, her pulse in her throat. She reached her brother's door and froze. It was open. Karen's stomach dropped. She stepped inside, gun raised. Then, a shadow moved. Karen spun, and her gun clashed against another. Angela, standing in the living room, her gun trained on a man slumped in a chair. The chief, alive. Karen's blood turned to fire. Angela's lips curled. You're late. Karen ignored her, eyes locked on the chief. His expensive suit was ruined. His face was swollen from a fresh bruise. And yet, he smirked. Karen stepped closer, gun trained between his eyes. You lost, she said coldly. The chief chuckled, shaking his head. Did I? Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. You tried to kill me, she said. You threatened my family. You think I won't end this right now? The chief tilted his head. Do it then. Karen's jaw clenched. But then, Angela spoke. He's right, she said. Karen blinked, startled. What? Angela stepped forward. Killing him won't fix anything. Karen scoffed. It'll feel pretty damn good. Angela didn't smile. The moment you pull that trigger, he wins. They spin it. You become the criminal. And the cycle starts all over again. Karen's breath hitched. Angela was right. Karen slowly lowered the gun. The chief's smirk faltered. Angela pulled out a USB drive and dangled it in front of him. You wanted control, didn't you? She murmured. Well, now we have it. Karen's eyes widened. What's that? Angela smirked. Everything. Documents. Videos. Proof. Of every dirty cop. Every bribe. Every murder. The entire network. Karen looked at the chief. For the first time, his face held something other than arrogance. Fear. Angela twirled the USB drive. This is justice. The chief's jaw tightened. You'll never win, he spat. Angela grinned. We already did. Karen turned away, breathing hard. It was over. Not in blood, but in truth. For the first time in her life, she had done the right thing. Angela tossed the USB to Karen. Time to end this. The files leaked nationwide. Every news station. Every headline. The chief was arrested. So were dozens of officers, judges, and politicians. The department burned from the inside out. Karen's name was cleared. The badge? She didn't want it anymore. Because she finally understood. Justice didn't live in a uniform. It lived in people. People who fought for what was right, no matter the cost. Angela disappeared into the shadows, mission complete. Carter went back to fighting the system. And Jake walked away a broken man, but alive. As for Karen, she didn't look back. She walked forward, straight into the fire. Because the war wasn't over. And she wasn't done fighting. The war was over, but the scars remained. Karen stood on the rooftop of a quiet building downtown, staring at the city below. The skyline glowed with neon lights, cars rushed through the streets, and people moved through their lives, oblivious to how close they had come to living under a system that owned them. She had spent years believing in the badge, believing in the rules. Now she knew the truth. Justice wasn't found in institutions. It was found in the fight. She thought about Angela, disappearing into the night, forever a ghost in the machine. She thought about James Carter, still out there, still exposing the corruption that ran deeper than anyone imagined. She thought about Jake, beaten, broken, but alive. A man who had lost his way but wasn't beyond saving. And she thought about herself. The chief was in prison. The system had been exposed. But this was just the beginning. Because the world didn't change overnight. There were more names, more corrupt men in power. And as long as they existed, Karen wouldn't stop. She took a deep breath, the wind whipping through her hair. Then she turned, stepping off the rooftop and disappearing into the streets. No badge, no backup, just her, and the fight for what was right. Because she wasn't a cop anymore. She was something more. And the war was far from over.